Okay, would you like to take your seats, please? Okay, we're going to start in about 30 seconds. So I did mention this morning about the historical links between this building and the UK recovery community. And Ruth, who's the deaconess at this church, is going to come and formally welcome you to High Street Methodist Church.
Grace and peace to you. It's really lovely to welcome you to High Street Methodist, which is an inclusive and affirming church. I'm quite new here. I've only been here a year myself. Like just this week, it's a year. So I understand from people who know more than I do that it's been at least 30 or 40 years that this church has been supporting 12-step groups. Not just people meeting here, but the way that the staff want to support those groups and facilitate. You get precious storage space. Not everyone does, trust me. But don't tell the others. But it's really lovely. We were really excited when we were asked if we would be able to host the Recovery Church because it's just so important. It's an important thing that we love in this church, but obviously more importantly, it's important for the millions of lives around the world that are transformed with the work that you're involved in. So we're really excited to see you. We hope, I don't know quite how yet, but we hope it will be some way an ongoing connection with yourselves and with Favour and with some of the other groups represented. So we're really happy you're here. We hope you're enjoying the space. And we are trying to build a venue hire business, so if you really like the space, tell your friends. But really lovely to see you, and some of you I look forward to seeing at the service later on. Thank you very much indeed. Thank
you. So often at conferences, they ask people, where have you come from, and work out who's travelled the furthest distance to be here. We're not going to do that because I think the gentleman walking in would win hands down. So the Reverend Bill Cruz, he's a regular supporter of the Recovery Conference and the Walk. He's travelled over from Australia, where he lives. It is a little bit late, but we can forgive that with the distance he's travelled. And Bill is going to be involved with the spiritual service tonight. But also, it's Bill's 80th birthday today. Yeah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bill. Happy birthday to you. Thank you. And if you want to hear the full sermon, There's a spiritual service at 6 o'clock tonight here, and Bill will be preaching. So the last leg of our conference, and we're flipping things over for this last bit. We're going to be talking about respecting others in recovery. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Being of service in our families, in our communities. So the next few speakers are going to be talking precisely about that. The next speaker is Tim Sampey, Chief Exec of Build on Belief, one of the best known recovery community organisations that are showing people respect right across London. Tim, over to you.
You can tell I'm serious. I'm going to take my coat off. Cool. Put my glasses on. Right, here we go. Afternoon, my name's Tim. I'm the Chief Exec of Build and Belief. Before I begin, a quick word about this insanely long PowerPoint. Okay? It's got very little to do with what I'm about to say, actually. I've assumed that many people here have got no idea who I am, which is perfectly understandable, and no idea what Build and Belief does, which is a bit of a shame. The PowerPoint, and it will just keep changing behind me, is there to tell you about our charity, to demonstrate through a series of quotations and pictures how we think, and show you a bit about what we do, and perhaps keep you entertained if the next 20 minutes turns out to be boring, irritating, or tedious, and it might, you never know. I hope not, because it took me bloody ages to write this, but never mind. And hopefully it will add a little context to some of the remarks. So all you need to know about the charity, it's a socially based support and befriending service. It was peer designed, it was peer implemented, and it's peer led. And it undertakes no therapeutic work whatsoever. It specialises in creating recovery communities that always run at the weekend, shame the walks on a Saturday, and run 7 days a week online. It's a social club. It's a family for those whose substance use has left them alone, isolated and unwanted. So, let's begin by having a quick look at what we mean by stigma. Just remember to take out the nicotine gum. You're going to think, he keeps slurring a lot. Right, a quick Google search. Definition 1. A strong feeling of disapproval that most people in society have about something, especially when this is unfair. Then definition 2. Any negative attitude, prejudice, or false belief associated with specific traits, circumstances, or health symptoms. Okay. Let's start by owning a basic truth. The chair of our charity is a chap called Roger Howard. He was the chair of the United Kingdom Drug Policy Commission, and their last big piece of work was about stigma. And what did that piece of work say? It said that with the exception of sex offenders, people who have addiction problems are the most hated and stigmatised people in the country. Right, my question is this. As a London-based peer-led charity, as a lived experience organisation, how do we challenge stigma and how do we respect others in recovery? In the simplest sense, I'm going to call it Bob, by the way, because it's much easier. So I'm not talking about someone, I'm talking about the charity. Bob challenges stigma simply by existing. If that sounds like a really bold statement, the explanation is based at the core of what it is to be a human being. Human beings are tribal creatures, and at the heart of every tribe is a sense of community. Unless you are a monk or a psychopath, and sadly I've met both, all human beings need other people. Full stop. So the question is, what do we mean by community? Think about yourselves for a minute. Pretty much every human being forms their own personal tribe, and membership tends to be based on communality of experience, personal interests, and family. The latter tends to be parents, partners, and children. Those are rare in the lives of people that use our services. Our individual tribes, your tribes, might include people you went to university with, people you work with on a day-to-day basis, those who share perhaps your interest in cars, exotic holidays, I've heard a few out there, or, as in my case, leaping about to any one of the dozens of expensive rock and roll bands that visit London every year and take a large part of my salary. Again, most of these things are out of reach or perhaps inconceivable in the moment for the people we see every weekend. Our community at Bob is very different, and it's rooted in our personal experiences of having had a substance use disorder. Our journey into, through, and sometimes out of recovery. We share other things in common. 68% of us have a diagnosed mental health problem. 30% of us have a serious physical health condition, and we all identify as either being in recovery or have a current substance use disorder. It is our travails, our suffering, our exclusion from wider society that unites us. In the most obvious sense, we create a community where it's completely acceptable to have all those problems because everyone around you is in exactly the same boat. At its best, it might be one of the few places where there's little to no stigma, as described at the beginning of this, because for once, we are in the majority. Great. It's a refuge from the wider world that doesn't want us, doesn't approve of people like us, and for many, it can be a platform that will, in time, allow a gradual reintegration into that very same world and hopefully a better life. Okay, now it gets tricky. If in one sense the services we offer are places where there's little to no stigma, or where it's minimalised compared to out there and the rest of society, there are still pitfalls, one big pitfall that can derail things. At the risk of dropping myself in it, fairly bad habit, but here we go, the most obvious and sometimes the least discussed is the thorny issue of what do we mean by recovery. In the original weekend service, which is almost 20 years old now, we instantly went to war with each other. There was a huge clash when we set that service up. The inevitable clash of recovery philosophies. And we tore whole lumps out of each other in doing this. You had those who believed in total abstinence, very often members of 12-step fellowships, at loggerheads with people like me who came from a very harm minimisation perspective and felt that improvement in health and well-being was more important perhaps than your relationship with substances. It was an absolute, if you'll pardon the expression, shit show, and it went on for months. Okay. The disagreements and arguments were passionate, often angry, and very often underpinned by profound personal belief, and we've all been there, that what worked for us must work for somebody else. That our own personal journeys informed the only path to ultimate recovery success. Clearly, such an approach is understandable, normal, and utterly doomed to failure. If we couldn't find a way to agree on what we meant by recovery, we were at risk of stigmatising our own clients, our own volunteers, and our own staff. Which is weird, isn't it? Because in my experience, drug treatment services, all the different organisations that are involved in this room have one thing in common. They're the most non-judgmental places I've ever been in my life. But we still fight about this. Lost my place. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by stigmatising our clients? Well, here we go. What if someone doesn't want to entirely stop their substance use? Perhaps they want to moderate it to manage some of the chaos in their lives, but otherwise continue with something they were enjoying and don't want to change. What if a combination of severe mental health problems and trauma means they were unable to maintain sustained abstinence for any length of time, even if they wanted to? Even with glasses, and look at the size of that print. I still can't read it. What if someone was happy on long-term opioid substitution therapy, decided their life was functional, manageable, and they didn't want to change it? If we defined what we meant by recovery within tight and specific boundaries, we were at risk of displaying the strong sense of disapproval, negative attitudes, and false beliefs I mentioned in the definition at the beginning. It took a while, a very long while, to agree that ultimately recovery could only be defined as a personal choice by an individual walking their own personal path. and it wasn't our place to either agree or disagree with that choice. Our role was and is limited to support, advice, the sharing of personal experiences that might help someone or encourage someone to take a step or two further along the road they've chosen to walk. We could point out the dangers or pitfalls they might encounter, the health risks they might potentially be running, and the negative consequences they might face because of their choices, but ultimately we had to respect the choice they made, whether we agreed with it or not. The only way we could run a stigma-free service was to respect the rights of the individual and not judge the lens through which they saw the world, including the lens through which they saw recovery. We could ask them to manage their behaviour to keep our services safe. We could work to encourage positive change, however small. We could role model the benefits that we individually had experienced on our own journeys through recovery, but we couldn't lay the path they were hoping to walk. All choices were valid. All choices are valid. This has not always been a popular approach within the wider recovery community. And there have been times when we've been accused of not taking a serious approach to the philosophy of recovery, the practicalities of recovery. But from our perspective, you can't run an inclusive and non-judgmental community if you define or decide an individual's goals for them. All you can do is create a space where they decide their own goals, their own end game, and choose to walk their own path. It's a subject that's constantly revisited in our in-house training programme, in staff meetings, and it raises no less passion now than it did 20 years ago. But we've stuck to our guns. Let me give you an example. I know someone who once had a very serious and very long physical opiate dependency. They eventually dealt with that, moved into a career where they're highly regarded, their skill set is much sought after, and yet they continue to use heroin recreationally 6 times a year. As someone who identifies as being in recovery and who had exactly the same substance use disorder, that is an anathema to me. On a personal level, I consider it extremely high-risk behaviour, and I would never consider doing it myself. And I've not used heroin in 20 years. On a purely personal level, I see it dangerous, and on a purely personal level, I see it as close to being unethical because of the job I do. Right? But let's be honest, that's my stuff. It's got nothing to do with this person at all. Who am I to have an opinion on their behaviour as long as it doesn't take place in my presence? They fundamentally changed their life, they found a niche in wider society, and they're happy with both how they live and the choices they've made. I wouldn't do it myself, but neither will I challenge their right to do it, because by doing that, I am not treating them as a human being. So, to come back to the question, a large part of respecting others in recovery for us turned out to be respecting their choices, helping them to look at the little wins and accepting their decisions as both valid and self-defined. Water. Right. Having had a little look at how we try to challenge stigma internally through our own individual recovery culture, ill-defined though some might find it, let's focus our gaze outwards. Returning to the definition I started with, it strikes me the problem from the other side of the fence out there is ignorance more than anything else, fostered by a relentless media that's always looking for a soft target to demonise. I should just buy one of those Who t-shirts, shouldn't I, with a target on it and go shoot here. I think the best way to challenge that is to find ways to create bridges from recovery communities into society and to demonstrate that essentially we're all the same, which I suspect Mr. Best is going to be talking about right behind me. Thought so. Well, let me tell you a story. In the original weekend service, in all Bob's services, we do the rehabbing, the check-in and check-out. Every staff meeting, every project, we sit around in a circle. This is how I feel today. This is what's going on for me. Like many people in recovery, at the beginning of my journey, I'm trying to rebuild family relationships, and I invite my father and my stepmother to come to the weekend service that I'm running. If you want a difficult personal experience, try doing a check-in in a room with 30 of your peers, with your dad sitting on this side and your stepmother sitting on this side. It wasn't fun. Now, they stayed for the whole day. It finishes. My stepmother grew up in a little village in West Sussex, lived there her whole life. Okay, she said, oh, this is amazing, this is lovely, this is great. was a wonderful check-in. I had an LGBTQI chap who was volunteering for me, whose check-in involved, do you like my tights? I bought them in the ladies' department at Primark, and my father literally spat his coffee across the room. Anyway, my stepmother said, you know, if I didn't live 70 miles away, I'd come and volunteer for you at the weekend. And then she said this, aren't they lovely? She said, they're just like normal people. Now, there's two things that are really interesting about that remark. The first is she didn't include me in it. And I'd been addicted to heroin for 25 years previously because she knew me as her stepson and she knew me as a human being. I wasn't a caricature from a newspaper of some morally deficient or untrustworthy individual. Secondly, it implies that she genuinely saw everyone else as somehow being apart from what she regarded as normal society. And do not take that statement the wrong way, because my stepmother is, and always has been, a lovely woman. We've got several ways of approaching this problem. All our services are run by volunteer teams. We've got 100, 120 volunteers, whatever it is, almost all of whom either identify as being in recovery or are in treatment for a substance use disorder. However, we've always encouraged members of the local community to come and volunteer with us, allowing them to share their own skills and to help others. You don't need to have or have had a substance use disorder to hang out with us. Much as with my stepmother, it encourages them to view us as people who've got a disorder, but to see us as they see their friends and neighbours, battling a problem that in truth they just don't understand. What is it that people used to say to me? Why don't you just stop then? I still think the same thing now that I thought then, which, if you pardon my language, is, yeah, and why don't you just fuck off? It helps to destroy the perspective, and it humanises the problem. And they take that perspective back out there, back into wider society. They begin to see cause and effect, to understand that the demon we're all battling internally isn't a matter of delinquency, but is often driven by a specific cause. We know this, don't we? We've seen the evidence base. Opiates. 80% of people with long-term opiate addiction, adverse childhood experience, and trauma. We've only got two rules of volunteering. You're not a danger to those around you, and you're not under the influence on the day you volunteer. Why? This allows people in early treatment or struggling with their mental health, and a lot of people do, to volunteer, to feel useful, to feel part of something, to feel worthwhile. Stigma is effectively challenged by including everybody who wants to be part of a community, and not by making the mistake of including only those who offer something on your wish list or who are believers in your organisational philosophy. Anyone who wants to come in, comes in. The self-efficacy and the sense of achievement that people get from being accepted, included, and allowed to do something that feels useful, worthwhile and meaningful has a profound impact on their lives and on their behaviour, which reflects both within the recovery community and outside in the wider world. These volunteers, often highly stigmatised themselves by their own family, their friends and their local community, begin to challenge that perception of perceived uselessness, often without knowing they're doing it, because they're demonstrating change, personal growth and confidence in themselves. It forces people out there to reassess their judgments and prejudices, and ultimately their relationship with those involved, especially away from the recovery community. Like many organisations, like many LEROs, there's a safety for our team in volunteering with and around people with the same life experience. Like many others, we offer an extensive training programme, one-to-one supervision, social events, annual award ceremony. We do our level best to recruit internally. Every volunteer that applies for a job gets interviewed, and trust me, that is hard work, because people apply for jobs you know you can't employ, but we always do it. They don't always succeed, but there's detailed feedback, there's support put in place to help them make the cut next time around if it can be done. Most of the people working for Bob are re-entering the world as paid employees with a pride and a sense of profession. And they actively role model the experience of stepping back into the world out there. So for all the people coming in, it's right in your face. This can be done. This is possible. It's not a hopeless choice. It's not a hopeless journey. In these small ways, we try to model and change the challenges and lazy assumptions that people have that they use to stigmatise people. More water. I'm getting there, David, I'm getting there. There's a challenge that haunts recovery communities, isn't there? Oh, wrong page as well. How do we build that bridge back into wider society and support people to have a foot in both camps? That's tough. We commonly stay in our recovery communities for years and years, whether it's Build and Believe, whether it's FAVORUK, your local mutual aid groups, or any of the other dozens of LEROs and organisations scattered around the country. It makes sense to do so. After all, for many of us, it's the only home we have. It's the place I still feel safest after 20 years. However, you can't challenge the stigma in wider society if you don't interact with it. In 1911, a Russian astronomer, whose name I just can't pronounce for the life of me, said, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in the cradle forever." The same is true for us. We may be the cradle where people's new life is nurtured, but eventually you've got to climb over the rails and toddle away. You've got to get back out there. Buddying and support is vital here. Among our staff team, bizarrely, there's a real interest in physical exercise. We're all a bit competitive about it. We've got gym bunnies, we've got lunatic cyclists, and frogs like me who clamber into a swimming pool at 7 o'clock every morning and paddle up and down very slowly for half an hour. We all know the benefits that come with regular exercise, physical and mental, but there's a social reintegration that comes from it too. We run a program where we meet our clients in partnership with one of our local providers at a local gym. We exercise with them. We have a cup of coffee and a chat. We support the positive change in lifestyle. We undertake a bit of hand-holding, and we help to build that bridge into a different world. I hate gyms. I won't run for a bus, but I do swim most days. I see the same people in a swimming pool every morning at 7 o'clock. Like them, I swim before I go to work. People will say, "Oh, what do you do?" I say, "Oh, I work for a charity that helps people with drug and alcohol problems." They say, "That's very interesting. How did you get into that line of work?" I say, "Well, I used to have a very serious drug problem." They go, "Oh, fuck." But you can see the evaluation going on behind their eyes. I swim with them every day. I've been doing it for 8 years. I'm on my way to work. I've got a job, me. I'm the same as them. It chips away at stigma. We've got to be bolder about this. We've got to get out there and stand up for ourselves. In our training, in our meetings, in our support groups, we chip away at the same message. A substance use disorder is a health problem and not a criminal matter. It is potentially a consequence of, and therefore a part of, human nature. If you look at opium, the Persians were growing opium on an industrial scale close to 5,000 years ago. They used to call it hulgil, the plant of joy. People like taking mind-altering substances. Our staff, our volunteers, our clients. That, to quote the great Bruce Springsteen, we are at the age of 43, and I'm standing here. When you can match it, you can slag me off. If you can't match it, wind it up. We are tougher than them. We are strong. We deserve our places in society. Oh, lost my track. Ultimately, we seek to create environments that empower, that emphasise the benefits of recovery. Oh, and look at that. I got it bang on the slide. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And Build on Belief, what a great example of an organisation that allows people in recovery to show respect for others by having opportunities to use their experience to help others, helps the people being helped and helps the person doing the helping as well, doesn't it? And he touched on some of the stigma within the recovery community. It's a can of worms, isn't it? With 2 speakers to go, I'm not going to open that one. But well done for mentioning it. So our next speaker, our third and final professor of the day, Dr. David Best. I contacted David when we knew that the theme was going to be about stigma on the back of something he published a few years ago, the Life in Recovery Survey. And there's some startling statistics in that. Things like people in recovery are twice as likely to be doing unpaid volunteering in the community. They're more likely than the general population to be working and paying taxes, less likely to be involved in criminal activity and so on. So I contacted David and he said, oh, that was years ago, we're doing other stuff now. Every time I cross paths with David, every couple of years, he's involved with something else. And he's going to talk to us now about inclusive recovery cities. David.
Now, this looks too complicated to be a slides? Is that? Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with a bit of a confession, which is I forgot to write down in my notebook, which I need, what my slides are about. So I am not entirely sure what's going to come up in these slides, other than it's about inclusive recovery cities. And the second kind of confession I'm going to make is, and thank you, Dale, clever academic reason, but because for my self-care, I have an appointment in Derbyshire this evening with 3 12-inch pizzas, the second series of The Wire, and my 16-year-old where I am. So, in that kind of forgot to do your homework thing, I desperately wrote down a few notes of what I'm going to talk about now. And I'm really impressed that Tony kind of second-guessed some of this stuff. So, I am 92 years old, back in a bit of a history trip to start with. So, when I started doing recovery research, starting saying recovery is a reality, there would have been lots of people go, I'm not entirely convinced about that, but uncertain about that. And one of the things that Tony mentioned there is we can now be pretty confident about saying that one of the ways you can define recovery is being better than well. It is not just about being asymptomatic and getting back to a 0 point. That better than well really means, and I'm a medical student when I worked in Birmingham and had the pleasure of working with Tony, who discovered when we used the World Health Organization quality of life scale that people in long-term stable recovery had better quality of life than the average member of the general public. And so the student who did this, I said, nope, you've made an arse of the statistics, go back and do it again, but she hadn't. On two domains in this questionnaire, the World Health Organization questionnaire, around neighbourhood belonging and social connections, people in long-term recovery were better than well. And it's really important that we cling on to this, because as Tony said, people in long-term recovery are also twice as likely to be active volunteers and participants in their local community, 79% compared to 39%. So you are much better off having a person in long-term recovery living next door to you than somebody who's never been addicted in the first place, because they make connected communities more than people who have never been addicted. And I'll come on to why that is important in a bit. Linked to that, and following from that partly, there are two things that we now increasingly understand about recovery that doesn't really fit with medical or treatment models of addiction. The first is recovery is a social process. It's something that happens between people. We talk about contagion. The second is it's generative. That when somebody recovers, there's leakage. It affects other people. Families, partners, neighbours, communities. It's generative. It's not something that you have a diseased body, you fix it, the diseased body gets better, you move on to the next one. As you create recovery groups, recovery communities, something happens in those communities that impacts not just on people attempting recovery, but on the much wider community. And the model we understand for this, we tend to think of as CHIME. CHIME is the kind of underlying principle, and hopefully most of you will have heard of this. What are the characteristics that are common to all successful recovery projects? CHIME: connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, empowerment. Now, unfortunately, it's not quite in the right order. It should be chumai, but it doesn't sound as good. Because it's really positive social connection generates the hope and belief that recovery is possible, motivates people to engage in positive, meaningful activities, which affords a positive sense of identity and a sense of empowerment and efficacy. The point about inclusive recovery cities is that model effectively scales up to a community level. When we started talking about better than well for individuals and the likelihood and probability of recovery, people were very dismissive, in the same way that when we talk about inclusive recovery cities as something that makes the whole community better, people are also cynical. But the point about this is, inclusive recovery communities or cities do three things. They generate social enterprise, they create something called reciprocal altruism, which I'll talk about earlier, and they generate collective efficacy. And collective efficacy is a wonderful term that comes from an American criminologist called Robert Sampson in a fabulous book called The Great American City, where if you want to look at the biggest predictor of lower crime rates, greater public health benefits, collective efficacy, which is defined as higher levels of cohesion and more shared expectations about what your neighbours will do for you, that predicts positive public health and public safety things. The argument I'm going to put forward here is that effectively what recovery communities can do is to create the conditions that both maximise the likelihood of each person recovering, but also make the community better for everyone. And the whole point about reciprocal altruism is it moves our language from giving back to reciprocal benefit. It's about we engage in activities that benefit us and benefit others. That's the point here. The last point, before I actually see what the slides show, the last point I wanted to make is, and Naitha quoted William White a couple of times. I'm going to say something about William White that is really important for this model, which is recovery precedes treatment, not the other way around. Effective, inclusive recovery cities constitute aftercare, yeah, but they also constitute prevention and early intervention because they effectively infuse connectedness in communities. And some of the things Tim was saying about contact, break down stigma, reduce exclusion. Oh, I seem to be going backwards. Now, I was given a lesson in how to use this at the start, and I've made an arse of it already. So, yeah. This is boring, but I'm going to say it anyway. When we switch to a recovery model, we're switching to a strengths-based model. And very quickly, what does that mean? No experts. This is fundamentally about partnership, collective working, number one. Number two, we stop thinking about cure as the removal of deficits and we think of it as the building of strengths. And those strengths are collective strengths. The basic bit of recovery science is, I want what you have and I'll do what you do to have what you have. It's a social learning process. So the more we can create the conditions that allow individuals to be exposed to attractive, engaging recovery icons or groups, the wider that spreads. And the wider that spreads not only to people with addiction, but to their families and to the people they're connected to. And I guess finally, and from my point of view most complicatedly, it means a different kind of science. Because recovery, a successful, inclusive recovery city in London will look different from Glasgow, will look different because it relies on what the assets and strengths are that are there already. And just fundamentally, what does the science say? Science is really simple about what works in recovery. Two ways of framing the same thing. You can describe the golden threads of recovery as jobs, friends, and houses, or someone to love, somewhere to live, something to do. Basic, simple things. We now think of the recovery journey as a minimum of 5 years. Over that time, we think of the growth process as going from highly contingent on external support to something that's self-sustaining after that time. The estimates of how many people recover keeps shifting. And I was at a meeting last week where somebody from the Recovery Research Institute now reckons that the proportion of people who achieve stable recovery is 70%. In 2011, I did some recovery training in North Wales for drug and alcohol workers, and I got the drug and alcohol workers, before I put the SAMHSA slide up, to estimate how many people recover. The average estimate was 7%. If you sit in a service and the only people you see are people in the revolving door in and out and people who never leave, then you're going to believe in the clinical fallacy that nobody ever gets better. The evidence of recovery is out active in communities, and the more you can mobilise that population, the greater the collective efficacy and the greater commitment. I'm not going to talk about that, it's just boring. Right. Many years ago, we did a study in Glasgow and Birmingham where we looked at what predicts recovery. The two biggest things: the more time you spend with other people in recovery, more things you do. We called this the Goya study, after the Spanish painter Francisco Goya. And Goya is an incredibly complex scientific term that stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And we were criticised on this on the grounds that, are you sure it's not the other way around? So subsequently, and then we published another paper on this, we showed in 3 English Drug Action Team areas that people who start meaningful activities show self-reported improvements in physical well-being, psychological well-being, and quality of life. If they stop meaningful activities, those things go down. People who are continuously involved in meaningful activities have higher levels of those things than people who don't. And that's in that slide, so that's a surprise to me. And this is, in effect, the model of change. This is the idea that what we are attempting to do is to think in a different way about recovery. Recovery is a process that involves active engagement and partnership. And I think the thing that change, which originally comes from the mental health field and was a systematic review of the evidence, in essence, we know that this is the model that is most likely to help individuals in their journey. The point about inclusive recovery cities is we scale this up. Chime becomes a model for communities. And the other point that I want to argue today is that an inclusive recovery model is an outside-in model, not an inside-out model. It doesn't start by trying to change what happens in people's heads or people's bodies and then move out to their family and then move out to their community. It starts in the other way. So and in the course of the last 5 or 6 years, I've collected just over 20,000 assessments of recovery capital, mainly from recovery residences in America, but nonetheless, that bit doesn't seem to work. Okay. And the model is, over the 5 years, this quadrant of personal recovery capital, which is generally described as self-esteem, self-efficacy, coping skills, communication skills, and resilience. How do we build them? We build them through the other things. You can define recovery from a recovery capital point of view as the interaction between the assets an individual can draw upon themselves and the assets available to them through the institutions with which they engage. Those institutions being family, treatment services, employers, housing agencies, neighbours. All of those things constitute institutions that increase or reduce access to resources. So in essence, for people with low recovery capital to start with, the point of the model is external engagement with resources to generate new social connections that creates the scaffolding around people through processes of social learning and growth. God, this is boring. Why don't I say something interesting? Tony, tell me to say something interesting. And here we have the statistic Tony was quoting earlier. The right-hand side is the only bit that matters there. This is from the Life and Recovery Survey. Effectively, this is the starting point for an inclusive recovery cities model. Virtually 80% of people in long-term recovery are active contributors to their community's well-being in one way or another. This is hugely important because that contribution creates what we call weak social ties, connections to people in your neighbourhood, exactly the Tim swimming pool conversation, that increases the two things we want in communities: higher levels of cohesion, greater expectations from your neighbours. Now, I assume for Tim, if he's been the same people go to swimming all the time, you don't worry so much about leaving your bag down while you're getting changed. You're not worried so much because it's the same people. You know them, you nod to them, you have a chat with them. It's increased shared expectations about behaviours, norms and rules. The whole point about the 80% is it creates the conditions that allow for those connections to happen. Now, Anne-Marie will recognise this slide because this is the second UK recovery walk. I think, was it the second one? Yeah. It was the second one. And most of you won't recognise that city because it's sunny. It's sunny and people are looking happy. This is Glasgow Green, and this was the second UK recovery walk. And more I think of, what's the point of these things? What is the point of this? And at the heart of the Inclusive Recovery Cities movement is the idea of public celebrations of recovery. Why would we have a celebration? Now, it's all very well people saying we have graduation ceremonies and we have a wonderful 12-step network. But there's something fundamentally different about public celebrations. So the minimum requirement for an inclusive recovery city is 4 public-facing events. Why? What is the point of things like this? Number 1, to celebrate and commemorate the achievement of recovery. And I'm going to keep stealing all your stuff, Tim. So Tim's point about you've done better than the people out there. It's something worth celebrating. 2, connection. You bring together people in recovery. So you make new networks and connections. And Anne-Marie will remember we had people from pretty much all over the UK took part in that event and that walk. 3, challenge stigma. To the people of Glasgow, you're effectively saying this is a public celebration. 4, to the people still in active addiction, you are saying here is something that is possible. Look, there are your iconic role models of success. 5, somewhere in that picture is Fergus Ewing, the Communities Minister for the Scottish Government. One of the aims here is to start to say influence, create policy, manage change. 6, to add to the civic calendar, to create events that become part of your community life and community well-being that are not just for people in recovery, they're for family members, they're for kids, they're for everybody. And many of you will be involved in and have run some of these public events, but these are measurable things about the impact of the celebration of recovery, not at an individual level, but at a community level. And the fundamental point of inclusive recovery cities is to create 2 different things: new assets, new connections, and new resources for people at different stages of recovery. And secondly, in doing so, to challenge stigma, outside in. We start with the broad access to community resources, we create social networks, and therefore afford the opportunities for people to grow and change. And the idea, so many of you will have heard of the concept of a recovery-oriented system of care. The difference between a recovery-oriented system of care and an inclusive recovery city is the centrality of 2 things. 1, peers are the absolute centre. It's about community processes and peers. And 2, it's about celebration. It's not about service connection, care coordination, case management. It's about celebration and public impact. The aim is to say, how do we create events that challenges stigma, builds bridges to new resources, builds new assets, but fundamentally generates collective efficacy. And the aim, and I go back to that point about recovery as a reality becomes recovery is better than well, to recovery becomes not something that is just integrated into the community, but is integral to the community. And this is the point about reciprocal altruism. The community itself grows and benefits from the examples of recovery, because the recovery model of public celebration, of connection and overcoming adversity becomes a part of community life and becomes a central part of community life. Oh, that's a bit of a dull slide. What are the requirements to be an inclusive recovery city? Led by lived experience recovery organisations, greater visibility and awareness of recovery, improved access to community resources, reduced stigma and exclusion, positive and inclusive social events, minimum of 4 a year, contributing to citizenship, volunteering and community participation, and participation in national and international forums. Too much, too much, too much. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so next week we have the launch event in Newcastle, in Revival Newcastle on the 25th. And here are our UK inclusive recovery cities as things stand. We also have Dublin in Ireland, and we hope to be having Galway in Ireland. There are currently 29 inclusive... Oh, there are currently 20... I finished. There are currently 29 inclusive recovery cities. The next two we will have are Cape Town in South Africa and Richmond in Virginia in the United States. What is and one of the things that I hope, and we have Mark here from York in Recovery, one of the things I hope that we do is we create a forum for sharing innovation, sharing hope, and creating that platform to celebrate. For me, the challenge is, how do we create an evidence that shows people in recovery benefit, their families benefit, and the wider communities benefit? Why do we talk about social enterprise, reciprocal altruism, and collective efficacy? Because essentially the aim of this model is to show recovery creates a sense of optimism and hope through connection. Optimism and hope through connection that is generative of well-being throughout communities, whether we start from the individual or from the family member. And the long-term goal is the reciprocal altruism thing of it becomes easier for people to recover, and the communities in which they recover become more visible, accessible, and stronger. Thank you all very much.
See Tony saying, what is she going to say now? So just a quick recap of where I think we're at today, so before I hand back to Tony. So I think just to welcome everybody again and say thank you for coming, but your presence at our conference and the walk tomorrow and willingness to engage is absolutely appreciated, but it doesn't mean we're flattered or honoured by it, especially if you're not willing to engage with us throughout the rest of the year. So consistent support is truly what matters. And if I wanted to be diplomatic, more diplomatic, I could say, while we appreciate your attendance and support at our conference, meaningful collaboration, ultimately, while we're glad to provide a platform for you at our conference, it's important to remember that meaningful collaboration is a two-way street. And when we don't see that same support and platforming in return throughout the year, it speaks volumes about the nature of partnership. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Tony. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, David. Not just informative, but challenging as ever. I was thinking very much earlier in the day about you get a bit of recovery and then you start to respect yourself, and then you get a bit more recovery and you go out and start respecting other people. But what you were saying, David, is the social comes first. You go out and you get involved and you respect other people, and that gives your recovery some momentum then. And I kept thinking about my personal recovery depends on unity and common welfare. It's not new, is it? Okay, we're going to take a short 10-minute coffee